Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation to speak to you tonight. In our mainstream debates about the climate emergency, a major culprit of the crisis is missing: the military. The military's carbon emissions are ignored by politicians, by academics, and the media. The United Nations has not put military emissions or expenditures on its agenda in any of its annual meetings. The Canadian government has failed to mention the Department of National Defence or the Canadian Armed Forces in any of its national climate reports or in its latest biennial report, its submission to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and this just got submitted at the beginning of January of this year. In the brief time that I have, I will discuss three major problems: military emissions, military expenditures, and how they are exacerbating climate injustice. I will focus on the Canadian and the American militaries. The largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels on the planet is the United States military. This is confirmed in US government documents and in congressional testimony. Last year in June, the Cost of War Project at Brown University released a report entitled Pentagon Fuel Use and Climate Change by Dr. Netta Crawford. She looked at the fuel records from the Defense Logistics Agency in the US from 2001 to 2017, the period of the US global war on terror. She estimated that over the past 16 years, the US military emitted 1.2 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases. Crawford also determined that the Pentagon's annual carbon emissions were greater than the annual emissions of mid-sized European countries. For example, in 2017, the US military emissions were 59 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, and this is larger than the emissions of Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. It is important to understand this in a per capita basis. This chart incorporates figures from the Crawford report, as well as from the European Union's emissions database for global atmospheric research. So you can see Sweden, 50 million metric tons annually, a total population of 10 million people. Emissions per capita is 5 metric tons per person. Canada, 617 million metric tons. We have a population of approximately 30 million people, and our carbon footprint is very large at 17. The United States, 5 billion, population of 324 million people, so 16 metric tons. But if you focus just on the military, using Crawford's number at 59 million metric tons, with the size of the US military of 2 million personnel, that is 28 metric tons per person or soldier. So the US military, including Canada, has a huge carbon footprint. Not only is the US military the largest consumer of fossil fuels in the world, it is also the largest landholder. According to the latest base structure report, the Pentagon manages a real global property portfolio that comprises 562,000 facilities and covers 27 million acres around the world. It has about 800 bases in 70 countries. The Pentagon spends between $8 and $17 billion on petroleum products. The Pentagon's energy strategy is called Energy for the Warfighter. It uses 75% of its energy to power its vehicles, like fighter jets, warships, and tanks, and only 25% of its energy is for stationary installations, like its bases. Of the major branches of the military, the Air Force, the Army, and Navy, it's the Air Force that consumes the most fuel. Vehicles like fighter jets are notoriously energy inefficient. So for instance, like the American Abrams tank, it gets 0.2 miles per gallon, whereas a very energy efficient vehicle like the Toyota Prius gets 51 miles per gallon. A fighter jet like the American F-15 or the Canadian CF-18, they burn 14,000 gallons per hour. And the cost to operate or manage one of our fighter jets is about $10,000 to $17,000 an hour. So 5 hours of operating one of our fighter jets could pay for a nurse or teacher in this province. And unlike commercial aircrafts that carry 200 or 300 passengers, they're carrying their luggage, they're traveling for professional and personal reasons, a fighter jet carries 1 or 2 pilots and a dozen munitions, and it's used to attack and bomb other countries. As well, fighter jets use a specialized fuel called JP-8, which is more highly refined and toxic than the fuel that is used in commercial aircraft. Furthermore, the energy platforms of all military vehicles, like fighter jets, tanks, warships, are locked-in energy platforms that are very difficult to modify to renewable energy. In Canada, among all federal agencies, it's the Department of National Defence, including the Canadian Armed Forces, that's the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the federal government. D&D is also one of the largest landholders in this country. It manages 5 million acres, 20,000 buildings, and 21 bases. The federal government does not publicly reveal the fuel costs and the fuel consumption of the Canadian military. I've had to file access to information for that. As well, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, countries do not have to fully and transparently account for their military emissions. Now, every country has to file a national greenhouse gas inventory, but military emissions are often aggregated in a category called 1A5, and there are exemptions for national security and permissions for confidentiality given to the military so they do not need to reveal the totality of their emissions. In both Canada and the United States, the military's carbon emissions are also excluded from the national reduction targets. In 2017, the Canadian government released the Department of National Defence's first energy and environmental strategy. It states very clearly on page 9, the federal reduction target will not include emissions from military activities or operations. So the military in both Canada and the United States do not have to account for and reduce their emissions. The next problem I want to talk to you about is military expenditures. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, global military spending in 2018 was a high of $1.8 trillion. This happens to be about the same amount of money that the International Energy Agency has said that the global community needs to invest to rapidly decarbonize our economy and meet the Paris Agreement target. The SIPRI report also shows that the United States is the top spender for military spending, then it's China, then it's Saudi Arabia. This past there you can see the United States, China, Saudi Arabia. Russia is 5th at only $61 billion. And then you can see Canada at 14th. This past March, President Trump announced his 2020 budget that further boosted the Pentagon spending to over $720 billion. But he also dealt the largest ever cuts to domestic programs, including Medicaid and the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Now, the U.S. Office of Management and Budget shows that for 2018, the Department of Defense budget was $656 billion, but the EPA's budget was only $8 billion, and Trump is going to reduce the EPA budget by 30%. I I went through the archives of the Office of Management and Budget, and I tracked this spending over time from 1997 to 2018. And you can see the US military budget has increased dramatically over this period, but the EPA's budget has flatlined between $6 and $8 billion. It is important to point out that the Pentagon has not been independently audited in over 20 years. The US Government Accountability Office, the GAO, has put the US military at the top of its high-risk list for fraud, abuse, and waste. In its 2019 spring report, the GAO stated, "The Department of Defense remains one of the few federal entities that cannot accurately account for and report on its spending or its assets. The US government is spending an exorbitant amount of public tax dollars on an unaudited department that has been engaged in fighting deadly and destructive carbon-intensive wars all over the world." Now, according to the SIPRI report, Canada has regrettably moved up to 14th in the world for military spending. And according to the Public Accounts of Canada, for the last fiscal period from April 1st, 2017 to March 31st, 2018, the federal government spent $32 billion on the Department of National Defense, D&D, but less than $2 billion on the Department of Environment and Climate Change. Moreover, the archives of the public accounts also reveal that over the past 2 decades, the Canadian government has increased D&D's budget, but Environment Canada's budget has barely increased, though the climate emergency and the ecological crisis have worsened. In December 2016, the federal Liberal government, in partnership with the provinces, announced the Pan-Canadian Framework for Clean Growth and Climate Change. Now, approximately $132 billion over the next 11 years will be invested in public transportation, green infrastructure, and clean technology. While this might seem like a substantial investment, it is wholly inadequate, and it is a fraction of the amount of planned spending for the Canadian military. 6 months later, in June 2017, the federal government released its new defense policy, Strong, Secure, and Engaged, that allocated over $553 billion. This does not include any life cycle costs. Over the next 2 decades, D&D will be buying new fighter jets, armed drones, attack helicopters, building more warships, recruiting more soldiers to maintain high-end warfighting. I must stress that there was no opposition to this defense policy. Not one federal politician, not even from the Greens or the NDP, dissented. And the future trends for military spending are grim. Under the 2014 Wales Summit Declaration, the 29 NATO members, including Canada and the United States, committed to build up their defense budget to 2% of GDP by 2024. But at our current excessive levels of military spending, we're at 1.3% of GDP. To reach the 2% NATO target, military spending will grow significantly over the next decade, which is the crucial period of time that we need to drastically reduce carbon emissions and prevent catastrophic climate change. I believe that NATO is a direct threat to the climate, and Canada needs to get out of this dangerous military alliance. So thank you. So what is the Canadian military doing with all of this fuel and with all of this public funds? Well, despite the national myth, the Canadian military is not a peacekeeping force. According to the latest UN peacekeeping statistics, Canada is currently ranked 72nd in the world, with only 49 soldiers wearing blue helmets. The United States, the most well-financed military in the world, is ranked 81, with a mere 31 peacekeepers. The top nations that are doing peacekeeping are poor developing countries like Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Nepal, and they are the ones that are going to be the hardest hit by the climate crisis. What Canada and the US militaries are doing is warfighting. Canada was involved in the 12-year combat mission in Afghanistan between 2002 and 2014, and we are complicit in war crimes in that country. Canada did the bombing and refueling of US coalition airstrikes in Syria and Iraq from 2014 to 2019. Canada led the NATO bombing in Libya in 2011 that totally destabilized North Africa. We are currently training battle groups in Latvia, Poland, and the Ukraine, right on Russia's border. We are provoking a war there. We have special forces that are operating across the Middle East and on the African continent with no public and parliamentary oversight. And you might remember in 2006, our Chief of Defense Staff, General Rick Hillier, said, "We are the Canadian Armed Forces. Our job is to be able to kill people." There is no role for the military, especially in this climate emergency. The truth is the military emissions and military expenditures are impeding our ability to achieve the Paris Agreement. They are fundamentally unethical. The Paris Agreement articulated several ethical principles that countries must adhere to in their climate policy making. Principles such as equity, you've heard Greta Thunberg talk about equity, transparency, accountability, just transition, and sustainable development. Well, ask yourselves, how can we possibly have a just transition or sustainable development when Canada and the United States use a disproportionate amount of fuel for their militaries and for war fighting? As you know, we have a carbon budget of less than 400 gigatons of CO2. This is the remaining fossil fuel that we can burn and keep below a global mean temperature rise of 2 degrees Celsius. But how can we have equity and an equitable distribution and allocation of the carbon budget when we will give a greater share of that budget to the military to power their fighter jets, their warships, and their tanks? Military missions and military expenditures are immoral. Last August, the Canadian government announced plans to spend $3 billion on a sole source contract for 260 gas-guzzling combat LAVs from the General Dynamics plant in London. This is about equivalent to the fossil fuel subsidies that the federal government gives every year. The federal government also announced in June tenders to buy 88 new fighter jets at a cost of at least $26 billion. This is a climate injustice. If we are serious about tackling the climate emergency, we must have a parallel process of disarmament and demilitarization alongside climate mitigation and climate adaptation. System change requires ending endless wars. Climate justice must mean climate peace. So in closing, a hopeful example is the country of Costa Rica that demilitarized 70 years ago and is now leading on disarmament and decarbonization. I encourage you to learn more about their story. The Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, we have a campaign, demilitarize, decarbonize, stop the wars, stop the warming. I encourage you to sign our petitions that are outside on the table and to sign up and receive our monthly e-newsletter. There's material on the back. Yesterday, our Finance Minister, Bill Marneau, launched public pre-budget consultations. He's asking for your feedback. I'm urging you to email him and your member of parliament to say that you want to reduce military spending and reallocate it to the urgent environmental and social needs that we have. I also want to urge you to tell our Minister of Environment, Jonathan Wilkinson, that you want military emissions fully and transparently accounted for and reduced. I would also like to invite you to attend a major international peace conference that's going to be taking place in our capital in Ottawa in May of this year. It's being organized by the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and World Beyond War. There's going to be amazing activists from the world coming. I believe that we need to connect the peace movement and the environmental movement to transform our economy to a zero carbon economy, to create a caring and sustainable society, and to ensure that we have a climate just and a climate peaceful future for our next generations. And finally, I would like to welcome you to email me if you would like a copy of my slides, and I would love to take a group picture with any of you that would like to hang around at the end with our signs, demilitarize, decarbonize. Thanks very much.